the other three I know.
Yep. Sweet. Alrighty, should we start on the questions?
Yep.
So it's divided into about 3 or 4 parts.
Yeah.
So yeah, we start with the first phase, which is the design phase. So how did you secure the project?
So I do apologise if these sound like rote answers, because
No.
I've provided these answers before.
Yeah.
So we secured the project because it was a council project. Back then, and I can't tell you the year, but it was started when it was under Waitakere. What were they called? Waitakere City Council.
Okay.
And then the project transferred across to Auckland Council once the amalgamation had occurred. The way we secured the project is there was a 2-stage process. There was an expression of interest in terms of, which is essentially submit your credentials. In this case, it was what they were looking for as a lead consultant architect, and then they were looking for that architect to have a team of other consultants under their umbrella as sub-consultants. So we responded to that, and essentially it's a exercise in capability, expertise, relevant projects in terms of what have you done that's similar, who are your consultant team, what are their experiences, what you can bring to the project, how you can be innovative, and all those things. So that's sort of stage 1. And then from there they drew up a shortlist, stage 2. I can't tell you how many people were on it, I think about five practices. And then it's a matter of essentially, in some ways, submitting the same sort of sets of criteria, who you are, what you've done, and all those things, plus fee. So the key difference, if you like, in some ways between stage 1 and stage 2 is the money. So at stage 2, because we've now got a shortlist of 5, the assumption being with that sort of process is that any one of those 5 are capable. You pick one of those 5, they should be, because they've met the criteria in terms of designing a library and a community centre, they can carry that out, and they have the expertise and knowledge and capability. And so to a certain extent, stage 2 is more about price in terms of you submit a fee proposal, but of course that fee proposal is not only you as the architect's fee, but all your consultants' fee as well, because you are the one point of contact.
Okay.
So you're providing a fee, and your fee actually covers architectural services, but also covers all the other consultants that they think you need, and they've generally listed them out. The only one who's generally not included in that list is the quantity surveyor. So we would have had, and this is from memory, we would have had structural engineer, services engineer, we would have had acoustics, we would have had traffic, planning, civil engineering, and landscape.
Which members of the firm were involved at this stage? So
This initial stage?
Yeah, the initial stage.
Me.
Okay, just you? Okay, cool.
Yeah. In terms of securing the project,
Okay,
yeah.
okay, cool. What was the project brief at that time?
Was there one?
Yeah.
Yeah. For a project like that, there has often, from a council point of view, been quite an extensive process in terms of briefing. So the brief they issued is pretty comprehensive, and it's quite a thick document, and it goes through all aspects that they consider to be important for the project. So broadly, in broad terms, that would have covered off, I guess, what I call the aspirational brief of the project, which is, we're building a new library community centre for this community, and we wanted to do these things. And then there's what I would call a functional brief, which is, the community centre has to be this big, the library has to be this big, hold this many books, we need these sorts of facilities, they have these functions, and we think they are generally of this rough order of size. We want meeting rooms and that sort of thing. And then, because it was Waitakere, they had a couple of other things, and I'm not saying they're unique, but they had one was a briefing element around the integration of art into the project, so that was always a strong driver for them. And by that, what they mean is they want you to engage with an artist as part of the project to deliver art which is integrated, meaning what they call not plonk art. Plonk art is something you plonk on the wall.
Okay.
You know. So we've done the building, we buy a painting, we just plonk it on the wall.
Who was the artist?
In this case, it was Chiara Corboletto. So yeah, that was a component. Although that process occurred a bit later, that didn't happen at the beginning. And the other component of the brief was sustainability. So they were very keen on sustainability. It's a pretty broad topic, but I guess one of the fundamental drivers they had was, amongst other things, was a energy consumption target, which is when the building's in operation, we've got a maximum limit as to the quantum of energy we want the building to be consuming. So that's sort of kind of how they drive a lot of the issues around sustainability, let alone issues around things like materials, paints, those sorts of things in terms of toxicity and the like, which is also part of that discussion.
Okay, cool. Does the client have an original budget for this project?
Yep.
Okay, what was the budget for it?
What was it?
Yeah.
Not enough. I think I think it's around about 8 or 9 million from memory, but this is
Okay.
going back a bit. But you know, again, one of the issues with council projects is that they've got quite a long process to go through to spend money. So often these sorts of projects end up in what they call a long-term plan. So they set aside some money. But of course, you know, when that's done, often there is insufficient information as to what they're really doing. The other thing that happens is time passes by, and what might have been a good budget in 2005, by the time you get to 2010, you've had escalation, you've had cost of living adjustments, and that budget, theoretically should have changed, but it hasn't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does it give you
Sure.
time? Yeah,
Can
sure.
I just ask a quick question? With most projects, do they usually not set an appropriate budget? With a lot of projects,
Do they not set an appropriate budget?
Is it
and do you
usually
always
lower
have to?
than
Yeah,
what
do you
you-
always have to spend more? Or
Everyone has a budget.
yeah.
Every project has a
No,
budget.
no, I mean like,
Yeah.
but the one that they initially set, for example, the 8 to 9 million, you said that
Yeah.
was not enough.
Correct.
With a lot of projects, is that the case?
Council projects, yeah. I mean, because they're spending public money for a start,
Yeah.
and so to a certain extent, whatever they're doing needs to be of value. Meaning, it needs to deliver all the things they need to deliver, but I think equally they're probably mindful they don't want to be excessively doing that either, because then everybody will say we're spending all our money on excessively expensive projects. So they want to do things well, but because their process, often their budgets are insufficient, primarily a lot of the time because of that time lapse, and that when the budget was set, the full extent of the project wasn't known either. Because things occur during the course of a project which might have not have been anticipated at the time the budget was set. Answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure.
Cool. Alrighty. Was there a time restraint that they gave you for this project? So did they give you a time limit on like, hey, this is when we expect the building to be finished?
Yes, they did, but I think part of the issue was everybody knew the amalgamation into Super City was coming, and so one of the issues with this particular project is, for example, Waitakere City Council had budget set aside to get the project to a certain stage. And so often councils do this. They say, well, we'll spend, say, 3 million this financial year, and then we'll spend the next 8 million or whatever it is in the next piece of financial planning. But equally, they knew what they wanted to do is they wanted to get the project to a certain stage and cross the line before amalgamation happened, and the project might have then just disappeared. So you could say, in some ways, it was an important project for Waitakere and that particular part of Auckland. But an Auckland Council long view might be, well, yes it is, or no it's not. So they're very mindful about getting it to that particular stage. So that was sort of a program target. What was unknown, of course, is what was going to happen after amalgamation, in terms of the transition of 5 councils into one, and what that meant for not only this particular project but also the City of Auckland.
Okay. Was the client involved in any of the design process?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
In what way were they involved in the design process?
So when you say client, for a council, that's many people.
Okay.
Because they all have, I guess, representatives of the various facets. Generally you might have the council might have a sort of a project manager who acts as sort of the go-between your team, consultant team, and his team. So, as you could imagine in a project like this, you've got client representatives for the library, because that's its own sort of entity. You've got client representatives for the community centre. So the project is unusual in the sense that it combines 2 building types into one. Often you might find a library, you might find a community centre. Here it was combined. So you've got those 2 clients. They seem to be the prime or the key clients. But then you've got people representing the art component of the brief from council. You've got people representing the sustainability component. At some stage you will engage with the people who are going to maintain and operate the building, because the project effectively sits in a park, because it's actually part of that reserve it sits on. Then you need to engage with parks because it's actually their asset. So even though council are building, somebody eventually owns the asset, and in this particular case it was going to be the parks department, because it's in there, it's in an on-their property.
Can you run me through the contract phase where you establish a contract, and was there any fees established at that point?
Yep. Yeah, well, the fees were established when we made our second stage submission.
Okay.
So that became our fee. The document that council issued as part of their brief, as part of their sort of the background for the project, from memory already contained an example of the contract that you would be entering into in terms of any special or specific conditions. So accordingly, when you were making your fee proposal, you knew what contract you were going to be signing. So that was done, if you like, fairly early on.
Okay.
In terms of our fees. But as I said, our fees that we submitted would get the project to the end of contract documentation. So in our fee bid that we submitted, there were no fees for admin and observation during construction, because that was unknown at the time, meaning from the client's point of view.
Were there any site documents gathered at this stage, so CT, PRM, LM, etc.?
Yep. For us, one of the things we were obliged to do as part of our service was to do a survey for the site. So we had to include that as part of our teams, in terms of, so we had a survey as part of our team. So that was one of the one of the early documents we had to submit. We also had to have a planner as part of our team, so they assembled all the information around the controls of the site, which were interesting. And in terms of other, that's generated boundaries and the like, it's relatively easy to obtain certificate of title and the like as well, to understand all that. And we were obliged to also obtain ourselves any effectively infrastructure, whether that be site services, power, and the like as well, understand where all those things were.
How was the site analysed, and who carried this out?
Probably the combination of people I just mentioned. There was an existing building on the site, which was the existing library and community centre, which we always understood was going to be demolished, and we were always going to be engaged in a new build. One of the things I didn't mention was before we were engaged and before we went through the process, they had engaged another set of consultants to do a series of feasibility studies, which was looking at the whole site and what they might do in terms of the options they had. The options being, keep existing buildings and refurbish, keep existing buildings and refurbish and add on, demolish the existing buildings and build new, demolish the existing buildings, build new, and have some commercial development, and so on and so forth. So those studies had already been undertaken by another consultant. So when we were engaged, it was very much demolish the building, even though it's a library and a community centre, which is what we need, in terms of viability and in terms of seismic issues, the age of the building. It was determined the best way forward was to demolish and rebuild.
Can you tell us a little bit about the historical or cultural context research they did on the site? Was there any guiding about that?
No. No. I mean, there's not. I mean, obviously there's some history to Te Atatu Peninsula, but nothing of any significance.
Okay. Which documents were obtained and used for site research, or was that the same as previously?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. Gotcha. Did the CT or any site drawings highlight any potential areas for concern?
I think the concern was it's a park, and from a planning point of view, which might not necessarily be your question, is what you're permitted to undertake in a park is actually relatively limited. It doesn't really allow for buildings of this size.
Okay.
So what's permitted activity within a park is usually things like toilet facilities, change facilities, relatively low scale and modest building with relatively small footprints. And I guess it's just through historical, I'm not quite sure what you call it, that it ended up being designated a reserve, even though it had a building on it at the time it was designated a reserve. Theoretically, someone should have realised that the site where the building was should have been designated differently in some way, but the whole thing was just called a park. So that was an issue. We always knew that whatever we proposed was going to be non-compliant. But equally, while the site area itself was quite large, because it I should have printed off a drawing, but it goes from where the building is right through to the road on all three sides. It's pretty obvious that you're not going to really build it in the park. You're really kind of going to design a building where the old one was. And I think the other issue for us was, we knew the budget was relatively modest already, and so we were thinking about ways that you might make the most of that. And there was an existing car park already there, and so we left it and said, well, we've already got a car park there. We know we need a car park, and we know we need to make it bigger. Why don't we just use the one that's there already and just make it slightly bigger? So what it really meant is the area that we actually had to design in was relatively well defined, and it's kind of where the building is.
Okay. Which group of consultants were used and why?
Well, it's pretty hard to do anything of size without consultants. So structural engineer, that's just obvious. You just need that. Services engineer equally in terms of and that, when I say services, that includes plumbing, drainage, electrical, heating, ventilation, all under that one umbrella. So they're the two key for us in terms of building. But equally, in terms of the planning process, we needed traffic reports done, we needed vehicle counts done in order to justify the fact we were still under in terms of our car parking requirements. We needed a planner to make the resource consent application and go through that process, so we needed that. we needed acoustics to make sure that one of the things in the brief was very clear that essentially they always thought that the community centre was going to be a noisy activity, the library was meant to be a quiet activity, and they were very mindful about how would you separate those two so one doesn't interrupt the other. So, it became obvious you needed an acoustic engineer to provide you with some advice around that.
Do you have like a go-to set of consultants that you use?
Well, obviously there's a myriad of consultants out there, and what tends to happen is, you tend to not necessarily, you don't have favourites, but what tends to happen is for whatever reason you end up working with sort of same consultants more over than not. So in this particular case we had Home Structure for structural engineering, and we've used them on, worked with them I should say, on other jobs, but not exclusively using them. Equally, it was E-Cubed in terms of services, and we've done a number of jobs with them, but equally we've used other consultants as well. So yeah, you tend to. Marshall Day for acoustics, they're kind of the best around, and so on and so forth.
Was there any specific design details requested by the council?
Design details.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about sustainability,
Okay.
They wanted that. If you're talking about like any client, they want a building that's fit for purpose in terms of the activities. They, because they're retaining the asset, they're not a developer, they're not selling it. They're mindful of the ongoing cost of that, and that can be maintenance, but also can be the cost to run. So, it may be that a client like that is prepared to spend a bit more capital in order to get a building that's cheaper to run, because that'll have a payback in the long term. So it's those sorts of things. Otherwise, it's I guess they've engaged us to design the building. It's a matter of us doing our work and then working with them to ensure that they're comfortable with what we're proposing.
Was there any restrictions on construction methods or materials?
No, not really.
Okay, so like everything was like an option for you guys.
I think so. Well, within the budget.
Yes, that's right.
I can't recall there was some issues around the soil,
Okay.
which can potentially impact on the design, the materiality, and the construction of a building. But the issues were really around. I mean, I think we clearly knew what the soil conditions were, but what we didn't know, of course, is what the soil conditions were like under the existing building. So you can sort of kind of extrapolate as to what they might be, but when we, I think it was under the community centre, or when that was demolished, parts of the ground were found to be a bit softer. So there was some additional costs around that. But that was not known at the time of design.
Did the building rely on any proprietary methods of production? Did you guys get any like custom made pieces, or like was there everything available already?
I think to a certain extent everything was custom
Okay.
made. Well, I mean, everything is made purposely for that building.
Okay.
They might be relying on well-known construction methodologies and techniques, but it's all made to measure.
Okay. Cool. How many members were in the project team, and who were they at the develop stage of design?
There was myself at the time. There was a woman called Sarah Heaslip who was working on it for the majority of it. We had another woman, Alicia Patel, she was involved in the project, and then there were a couple of others, but it was sort of a core team of sort of 3 or 4 from our side of things.
Okay, cool. Did the consulting change any design outcomes?
You mean working with the consultants?
Yeah.
No, well, no, not really, in the sense that it was sort of a collaborative design process. So, for example, the library has a double floor. So, the library has there's a